Filipino women had a very, very strong character. They were head of households. And again, and that's because of ancient Philippine history in which there was an egalitarian society. So it was nothing for the Filipino woman to begin to start businesses, as well as to actually conduct and negotiate with the establishment. They were also the retainers of culture. It was through them that we as children began to know what our Filipino heritage was.
When they were living in their different villages in the bayous, the children were sent to the city to be in school. And after the school ends, they would go back to their different settlements in the bayous and maintain the life they had. And through this influence between the city and the bayou life, many of the children decided to seek other professions than their forefathers. So they decided to become teachers, to be physicians. They retain their Filipino values, and they go back during summertime, they would go back and camp in their villages and retain that life in the bayou. So even up to today, this day, the Filipino descendants, even 7, 8 generation, they would still long for that life.
The average or the typical American family is mama, papa, and children. The theory of relativity as far as a Filipino is concerned is that everybody within his reach is a relative. They shared in their income, and they shared in everything else that was there. What we had was theirs, and what was theirs, we had. The whole success of this was that it kept the Filipino family and the Filipino community intact. It was able to withstand all those things that the Filipino Americans had to face outside in a hostile and alien world. They had at least a good support system, and that was the value of an extended family, and it still happens to this very, very day. To the second generation, so defined, were the children of the immigrants, who we call the first generation. And among the pioneering first generation, those who came before 1945, we had a great time because we were the coolest, the most rhythmic, the best dressers. We were fashion setters in the same way that our men were and our women were. I mean, the older generation. We had jazz. Jazz was just beginning to grow up. We had such a thing as basketball tournaments, particularly in up and down California. And after basketball tournaments, dances. And that's where we got a chance to meet many of our own peers that to this very, very day are our very, very close friends. We were Filipino enough as far as our culture was concerned. Respect for the elders, our sense of authority. But we were also American, and we were trying to do the best of two worlds.
I think maybe many of the second generation Filipinos adhered to many of the cultural practices of their parents, but rejected learning the language. And maybe that is something that all groups in the world have experienced in one way or another. People growing up as adolescents don't want to be different.
The Filipino communities had several types of organizations in the 1920s through the 1960s. These organizations were basically fraternal in nature. You have the Caballeros de Dimasalang, you have the Legionarios del Trabajo, and the Gran Oriente. These were basically the larger lodges. And they provided a basis of community for these various Filipinos. So basically, there used to be a saying that if you have two Filipinos, you'd have three organizations: your organization, my organization, and our organization. Filipinos just love to get together.
There have been hundreds, literally hundreds of Filipino newspapers that have chronologically appeared over the years. But I hasten to add that many of them have become what's called fly-by-nights. Here today, gone tomorrow. Or they're published for a month or 2 months. Lack of advertising, they go out of business.
The Filipino newspapers in the United States were scattered throughout California, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii. There were different types of newspapers during that time frame. The largest and perhaps the oldest was the Philippines Mail, which was published out of Salinas, California. And the scope of that newspaper was nationwide. They had correspondents coming out of Chicago, New York, Seattle, Hawaii, and they looked at the issues. And they discussed the major topics that were going to impact on Filipinos in the United States with the independence of the Philippines. You also had newspapers that were scattered throughout the Central Valley of California. And these were seasonal in nature, so as the Filipinos moved up from the Imperial Valley up through the Central Valley, the newspapers would move with them.
Religion played a very important role in the lives of Filipinos in Hawaii. For one thing, the Spanish who colonized the Philippines brought with them Catholicism. So a great majority of the Filipinos are Catholics.
However, in some cases, that church, the Catholic Church, was very, very indifferent to Filipinos during those days. Other churches made some inroads into the Filipino community. The Protestant mainline churches that included the Baptists and the Methodists, the Congregationals, the Episcopalians, and the Presbyterians. But by and large, Filipinos were Christian. That's what set them apart as well from other Asian Pacific American groups, and they remained that way.
Remember about the Pearl Harbor experience was that as a child I was frightened because my mother cried all the time and saying that this probably is it. We'll be attacked by Japan continuously, and this will be the end of us. A lot of my friends and classmates were Japanese. They were very good friends of mine. And I thought, now what? As a 13-year-old, I didn't know what to think of it. That stayed with me because among the Filipinos, talk was about Japanese and their being the enemy. Not just the Filipinos, but all other groups as well. I began to think from that Pearl Harbor experience more and more about the questions of who are we? What are we being taught in school? Are we Americans? Are we Filipinos? And if we are, what does that say about loyalties? Who are we loyal to?
Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934, which gave the Filipinos their independence or a Commonwealth status in the Philippines, stated that Filipinos would be called on to defend the United States' interests in the Philippines. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Filipino community here in the United States wanted to join the military, but unfortunately, they could not because of the law. In January 1942, President Roosevelt changed the law, and Filipino Americans then wanted to enter the military. One of the things that they wanted to do was form a unit to go back to the Philippines to defend it. So in February 1942, the 1st Filipino Battalion was formed in San Luis Obispo. And the staffing of this unit consisted of Filipinos who were stranded in the United States. The units eventually became large enough to form 2 regiments, the 1st Filipino and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments. The Filipinos were given an opportunity to become citizens in 1943 by virtue of the fact that they were serving in the military. A Gallup poll was held around May 1942 to see if these Filipinos who were serving the military should be given the opportunity to become citizens. And it was overwhelmingly supported by the American people. In February 1943, there was a mass swearing-in ceremony at Camp Beale, California, with the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment. And there, over 400 Filipinos took the oath of allegiance to the U.S. to become citizens. And this continued throughout the time frame that the 1st Regiment and 2nd Regiments were in the United States. The Filipinos were scattered throughout the various services during World War II. We had some in the Marine Corps, we had them in the Air Corps, and of course we had the notorious affair where the Filipinos were strictly stewards in the U.S. Navy. In fact, we have one incident where Lieutenant Ruben Sunco graduated from Annapolis as a naval officer, but could not be commissioned because he was Filipino. And so he was commissioned as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army. He was killed in action in the Philippines in 1944. World War II opened the doors of opportunities to Filipino civilians who did not go into the military. They moved into the defense industries, working as welders, the shipyards, riveters in the aircraft factories. And as the male population moved out of the civilian government positions, Filipinos moved into them. You had Filipinos who were trained as engineers, could not work as engineers in the 30s, now working for the government as engineers and scientists. The women during that time frame, many of them had the opportunity to become nurses, working in the hospitals, working in the military. The American government quickly discovered that as their troops occupied foreign countries, that their soldiers were marrying or becoming romantically involved with foreign women. And so they passed a law, the War Brides Act, which went from about 1945 through 1953, which invited these women and their children to come to the United States without regard to any immigration law or act. They took advantage of this to bring their families from the Philippines. And in the case of the 1st Regiment, you have thousands marrying Filipino war brides. These groups brought their wives or children to the United States, and this gave us a big boost in a number of families and established the communities throughout the United States.
This is now post-1946. The Philippines is no longer a territory, nor is it any longer a commonwealth. It is an independent nation which means, therefore, that diplomatic relations begins with the Philippines and the United States. There is also the